Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The steps behind me grow louder every night. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Echo of Unseen Footsteps. I arrived at the house just as the sun began to dip behind the mountains, casting long, thin shadows across the overgrown yard. It was the kind of house that looked forgotten by time, peeling paint, sagging roof, and windows clouded with grime. But for me, it was a refuge. A place where I could finally be alone, where I wouldn't have to face the world or the pitying looks of people who knew. The accident had taken Ethan from me just 6 months ago, my little brother. I was the one driving, and I had walked away. He hadn't. The guilt clung to me like a shadow I couldn't shake, and no matter how far I ran, it followed. That's why I came here, to the outskirts of a town where no one knew me, to start over, or at least try to. The house had been on the market for years, far too cheap for what it was. The locals at the diner had whispered when I mentioned the address, but no one had the courage to say why. It didn't matter. I wasn't afraid of ghosts. Real life had proven to be much more terrifying. The first night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. I unpacked what little I had brought with me, trying to distract myself from the stillness pressing in from all sides. When the clock struck midnight, the creaks and groans of the old house began. Normal enough, I told myself. Old houses settle. But then I heard them footsteps. Soft, deliberate, just behind me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. My fingers gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, but when I turned around, there was nothing. No one. I took a deep breath, shaking off the wave of unease. I was being paranoid. Of course I was. Between the move, the isolation, and the grief that clung to me, my mind was playing tricks. I hadn't slept well in months, haunted by the memory of Ethan's face that night, the shattered glass, the blood. I forced the memory down. But even as I climbed into bed that night, pulling the heavy blankets around me, the sound lingered. It had been so clear, like someone was there, just behind me, watching, following. I lay in the darkness, eyes wide open, straining to hear anything. The house remained silent, but the sound of those footsteps kept echoing in my mind, as if they had never truly stopped. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Hall. The footsteps echoed in my mind, long after the silence of the house had settled in. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing, every distant noise pulling me back to that moment in the kitchen when I'd been sure someone was there. It had to be in my head. I couldn't let myself spiral. But the next night, it happened again. I was reading in bed when I heard them. Faint at first, as though someone was pacing just outside my room. I sat up, listening intently, waiting for the sound to fade like it had the night before. It didn't. The footsteps grew louder, heavier, as if whatever was walking the halls had gotten closer, more confident. My breath caught in my throat. I threw off the covers and crept to the door, heart pounding, every nerve on edge. Slowly, I turned the knob and opened the door, expecting something. Someone, but the hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow of a single nightlight I had plugged in. The air felt thick, heavy, pressing against my skin. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound to return, but it never did. The following days were no better. The footsteps came again, always starting at night, but creeping into the daytime now. I could hear them while I was in the kitchen or in the living room, a slow, deliberate rhythm that followed me from room to room. Every time I tried to catch whoever or whatever it was, I found nothing. The anxiety gnawed at me, twisting my thoughts until I could barely think straight. Sleep became impossible, my nights filled with tossing and turning, listening for sounds I didn't want to hear. I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. The house, once a place I'd hoped would bring me peace, had become a prison. Its walls seemed to close in on me, every shadow in the hall a reminder that I was never truly alone. Mrs. Fisher, my closest neighbor, came by one afternoon, bringing a loaf of bread and her ever-watchful eyes. We stood on the porch as she looked me over with the quiet, knowing gaze of someone who had seen more than she let on. "You're living in that house now," she said softly. "Strange things have happened there. A family lived there once. Disappeared, all of them. No one knows what happened, but the house, it hasn't been right since." I tried to brush off her words, forcing a smile. "I'm sure it's just stories." But deep down, I knew the truth. The footsteps hadn't stopped since the moment I arrived. And whatever was in the house with me, it wasn't going to leave. Chapter 3. The presence draws closer. The days blurred into one long, sleepless stretch. The footsteps followed me relentlessly now, no longer confined to the night. In the morning, I'd hear them shuffle just outside my bedroom door, slow and deliberate. By midday, they'd quicken, darting behind me as I walked through the house. And at night, they grew louder, sometimes thunderous, like boots stomping through the halls, other times frantic, like someone running, desperately trying to catch up with me. I couldn't escape them. I sat at the kitchen table, eyes heavy with exhaustion. The loaf Mrs. Fisher had brought me sat untouched on the counter, hardening. I wasn't eating. I wasn't sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of something standing over me, waiting. I had to know what was happening. The house wasn't just haunted. It was angry, and it was closing in on me. Desperation gnawed at me until I finally broke down and called David Ashford, the town's historian. I had seen his name in some of the old records at the local library, where I'd tried to lose myself in research about the house's past. He was an older man, his voice a rough whisper, worn by years of telling old stories. When I asked him about the house, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "I've heard rumors," he finally said. "The house, it has a history. Most people don't stay long enough to figure it out. You're not the first to hear footsteps." Others reported the same thing. Some said they felt like they were being followed, watched, but no one knows who or what is doing the following. I shivered, gripping the phone tighter. What happened to the family who lived here before? "They vanished," David replied, his voice dropping lower. "No one saw them leave. One day, they were here. The next day, gone. No signs of struggle, no goodbyes. Just gone." The weight of his words pressed down on me. The walls of the house felt closer, suffocating. I thanked him and hung up, but the conversation stayed with me. This house had consumed others before. What was stopping it from doing the same to me? The footsteps returned as soon as I put the phone down, heavier this time, as if whoever or whatever was in the house with me knew I was trying to uncover its secrets. I began to question everything. Was this real, or was I losing my mind? Was the house haunted, or was I haunted by my own guilt? The car crash that killed Ethan felt like a shadow trailing me, just like the footsteps. Every time I turned around, expecting to see a figure in the doorway, I felt my brother's absence instead. The grief I had buried for months was surfacing, mixing with the terror of whatever was in the house. I wasn't sure where the house's curse ended, and my guilt began. But the footsteps, they were always there, and they were getting closer. Chapter 4. unseen terror. The footsteps were louder than ever, pounding in my ears as I lay wide awake in bed. It felt like the walls were closing in, the air thick with dread. Every breath I took seemed heavier, every shadow more oppressive. I hadn't slept in days. How could I, when every night brought more terror than the last? Then, the sound changed. It wasn't just the usual, slow, creeping shuffle behind me. This time, the steps were fast, urgent. They echoed through the house, not as if someone were merely walking, but chasing me. My heart leapt into my throat as the realization hit me. Whatever was following me wasn't trying to hide anymore. It wanted me to know it was there. Without thinking, I bolted out of bed, my feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. The footsteps followed, matching my every move, growing closer with every step. I tore down the hallway, past the flickering lights, my breath ragged and uneven. The house seemed alive around me, each creak of the floorboards amplifying the presence that hunted me. I raced down the stairs, my vision blurred with panic. No matter how fast I moved, the footsteps were right behind me, matching my pace with a terrifying precision. I stumbled into the living room, my chest heaving, and collapsed to the floor. Tears welled in my eyes as I pressed my back against the wall, shaking. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't escape. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It was as if the entire house was holding its breath, waiting. For what? I didn't know. But then, the house began to change. The lights flickered violently, casting strange shadows on the walls. Doors creaked open, even though I was the only one there. And those shadows, they moved. Not with the rhythm of the flickering lights, but on their own, as if something was creeping through the darkness just out of sight. I glanced toward the far corner of the room and caught the briefest glimpse of a figure there, and then gone, vanishing before I could fully see it. I was losing control. Sleep deprivation and fear twisted my reality into something unrecognizable. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining the lights, the shadows, the figure. But the footsteps, those were real. I could feel them now, vibrating through the floors, pressing against my skin like a living thing. I dragged myself back to my bedroom, my hands trembling as I closed the door behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was this just the house? Or was my brother's death finally catching up to me? Was the guilt I carried manifesting itself in this nightmare? Or was the house truly haunted? The line between reality and madness blurred with every passing second. I could feel myself slipping, my grip on sanity loosening. But I couldn't let it win. Whatever it was, I had to find answers before it consumed me whole. Chapter 5. The past comes for her. The days blurred together in a haze of fear and exhaustion. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind outside made me flinch. The footsteps had become relentless, louder with each passing night, echoing through the house like a death knell. It wasn't just the house anymore. I could feel them behind me when I left, as if whatever haunted me refused to be confined to those four walls. Desperate for answers, I dug deeper into the house's history. Town's library became my only refugee from the terror inside the house, though even there, the footsteps seemed to follow. I found old newspaper clippings, faded and yellowed with time. They told stories of previous tenants who had vanished without a trace, just as David had warned me. The strange occurrences they reported were hauntingly familiar footsteps, shadows, and the ever-present feeling of being watched. Each report ended the same. The family left abruptly, or worse, disappeared entirely. But it was one article that caught my attention. A woman, her name long forgotten in the dust of time, had died in the house. The details were vague, the cause of death shrouded in mystery. Some claimed it was an accident, others whispered that it was murder. But the article left one thing certain. Her death had marked the beginning of the strange occurrences in the house. As I read, the footsteps echoed louder in my mind, a constant drumbeat of dread. It was as though whatever haunted the house knew I was getting closer, knew I was uncovering its secrets. The footsteps had been there for her too, the mysterious woman who had died. Was she the one following me now, or was it something worse? The more I learned, the clearer the connection became. The footsteps seemed to intensify after each revelation, as if the entity was responding to my investigation. But it wasn't just the house that felt haunted, it was my own past. The guilt over Ethan's death clung to me, suffocating. Was I bringing this darkness into my life? The thought gnawed at me, twisting my perception of everything around me. Was it possible that my own trauma had drawn this thing to me? I could no longer tell where my guilt ended and the haunting began. The house, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. Every corner seemed alive with malice. Every shadow hid a lurking figure. I'd see it in the periphery of my vision, a flicker of movement that vanished as soon as I turned. The footsteps followed me everywhere, a constant companion in my spiraling madness. I'd hear them when I went to the grocery store, when I took a walk in the park. They were everywhere, as if I could never escape. I wasn't safe. Not here, not anywhere. My mind fractured under the weight of it all: my brother's death, the house's curse, the relentless footsteps that haunted every moment. But I couldn't stop. I had to know the truth, even if it destroyed me. The past wasn't just haunting me, it was coming for me. Chapter 6. No escape. The house had been a prison, but I thought escaping would be my salvation. I packed hastily, the bags clumsy in my hands. My heart raced as I stumbled out the door, barely glancing back. I had to get away. I needed to be free of the footsteps that seemed to echo through every corner of my mind and home. I sought refuge with Linda, a longtime friend. She had a cozy, sunlit apartment in the town, a place I hoped would offer the respite I desperately needed. But as soon as I crossed her threshold, I felt the familiar chill. The footsteps followed me, relentless. They haunted me even in her home, echoing down the hallways, pounding in the silence of her living room. Linda's concerned eyes tracked my movements, but I couldn't explain what was happening. How could I? She would think I was losing my mind. "Evelyn, are you okay?" Linda's voice was tinged with worry as I paced, trying to ignore the phantom sounds. "You don't look well. Maybe you should see a doctor." I shook my head, unable to articulate the horror that gripped me. The footsteps grew louder, angrier, almost as if they were taunting me. They moved with a new violence, rushing at me in bursts of frantic energy. I could hear them charging down the hallway, as if the entity was determined to corner me, no matter where I tried to hide. Objects around Linda's apartment began to move on their own. A lamp tipped over, sending a crash through the room, and the mirror on the wall cracked with a shattering sound. I jumped at every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of air. The once benign space was now a reflection of the terror I couldn't escape. Linda watched in horror as furniture shifted, mirrors cracked, and windows slammed shut on their own. "What's happening?" she cried, her voice breaking as she watched me spiral further into fear. The shadowy figure I had glimpsed in the house grew clearer with every moment, though it was never fully visible. It lurked just at the edge of my vision, always just behind me, a dark specter of menace. I could feel its presence like a weight on my shoulders, pushing me toward the brink of sanity. I tried to explain to Linda, but words failed me. How could I describe the shape of fear, the terror that seemed to have a physical form? The closer I got to understanding the truth, the more aggressive the entity became. It seemed to thrive on my fear, growing stronger and more insistent, its shadowy form becoming a constant, threatening presence. I was trapped in a nightmare with no end in sight. The footsteps were relentless, the figure always just out of reach, and the entity's rage seemed to follow me wherever I went. There was no escape. The terror had become my shadow, and it was determined to consume me whole. Chapter 7. The Revelation. The footsteps had become a cacophony of torment, relentless and deafening. They pursued me, their rhythm chaotic and desperate, as if urging me toward a final reckoning. Linda's apartment no longer offered refuge. It had turned into a stage for my nightmare. I had to know the truth, had to confront the source of this horror before it consumed me completely. My research had led me to the local historical society, where old records and personal accounts painted a harrowing picture. The woman who had died in the house was named Margaret Donovan. Betrayed by someone she trusted, she was left to die alone in the very home where her spirit now lingered. Her death had been marked by a cruel twist of fate, a betrayal that left her to suffer in isolation, her cries for help unanswered. As the footsteps grew louder, more frantic, I realized the parallels between Margaret's story and my own guilt. My brother's death had left a void in my soul, a chasm of regret and remorse that I had been trying to escape. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became Margaret's death and my own pain were intertwined. Her suffering was my suffering. Her betrayal echoed my guilt. That night, I returned to the house, the air thick with the promise of a final confrontation. The footsteps echoed louder than ever, their rhythm a drumbeat of dread. I fled through the darkened hallways, my heart pounding, until I found myself cornered in the living room. The shadows twisted and writhed, converging into a grotesque, shadowy figure. My breath caught in my throat as the figure took shape, its form a dark amalgamation of fear and sorrow. Its face was obscured, but the fleeting glimpses revealed something horrific, an unsettling resemblance to my brother's features, twisted in agony. The sight was almost more than I could bear. "Evelyn," the entity's voice rasped, echoing with a distorted, agonized tone. "Why did you leave me?" The words cut through me like a knife. The entity was a manifestation of my guilt, a tangible representation of the emotions I had tried to bury. It forced me to face the truth I had avoided for so long. I had been running from my own remorse, from the reality that I couldn't change the past or undo my mistakes. I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I didn't mean to." The entity's form shifted, morphing into a grotesque parody of my fears, twisting and contorting as it reflected my inner torment. It was a physical manifestation of everything I had tried to escape: the betrayal, the guilt, the grief. There was nowhere left to hide. I had to confront it. I had to face my guilt head-on and accept the pain I had been running from. The house, the footsteps, the entity, they were all a part of me. In that moment, I understood. The true horror was not just the house or the footsteps, but the unresolved sorrow within me. Chapter 8. The Final Step. The living room was dark and suffocating, the shadows pressed in like a vice. The grotesque figure loomed before me, its shifting form a hideous reflection of my own turmoil. The footsteps pounded louder, a relentless drumbeat of dread echoing through the empty halls of the house. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing as the weight of my guilt pressed down on me with crushing force. I stood alone, cornered by the specter that mirrored my deepest fears. Its face twisted into a grotesque parody of my brother's features, its eyes hollow, filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach into the very depths of my soul. The air crackled with an electric tension, the atmosphere heavy with the remnants of all my unresolved pain. "Why did you leave me?" the entity rasped, its voice a chilling echo of my brother's anguish. "Why did you abandon me?" I sank to my knees, tears streaming down my face as the full weight of my guilt crashed over me. My brother's death had left a void I couldn't fill, a darkness that had consumed me and now took shape in this living nightmare. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words barely audible over the deafening sound of the footsteps. "I never meant to." The entity's form wavered, shifting as if it were trying to communicate my own inner turmoil. It wasn't just about his death, it was about my failure to accept it, my refusal to forgive myself. The terror had become a reflection of my unresolved sorrow, an echo of my deepest regrets. I realized then that the only way to break free was to confront my guilt directly. I had to forgive myself, accept the past, and let go of the pain that had shackled me. As the footsteps grew unbearably loud, almost deafening, I took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage I had left. "I forgive you," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "And I forgive myself. I can't change what happened, but I can let go of the guilt." The entity's form flickered, the shadows writhing as if struggling against an unseen force. The footsteps began to slow, their frantic pace diminishing. The oppressive weight that had clung to the house seemed to lift, and a strange silence settled over the room. I stood up, the house now eerily quiet. The shadows were still, the oppressives of the entity seemingly gone. The footsteps had ceased, leaving a profound silence in their wake. I felt a tentative sense of peace, but as I made my way through the quiet rooms, a faint echo of a footstep rang out in the distance. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible sound, but it was there, an unsettling reminder that the past never truly fades away. I left the house, stepping into the cool night air, a sense of tentative liberation mingled with a lingering dread. The past had not been entirely vanquished, but I had faced it, and for now, the haunting had ceased. Whether it would return or remain a shadow at the edge of my memory, I didn't know. The house stood silent behind me, its secrets locked away for now. The final step had been taken, but the echoes of the past would always be a part of me.